Hi, everyone. I'm Rich Harwood, and this is another episode of Harwood Half Hour. Today, the real power of public knowledge. You know, so many people across the country, including folks who use the Harwood Institute approach, are doing community forums, public meetings, our own approach, community conversations. And I often think that there's so much more power that we can gain from what we learn from these conversations. And that's what I want to talk about today. What is the real power of the public knowledge we gain from this engagement work? And so before I get started, shoot me a message and let me know if you can hear me and where you're from, where you're piping in from today. And also, here's a question to be thinking about as I go through this episode this afternoon. What do you think is the real power of public knowledge? What do you think is the real power of public knowledge? You know, when I was thinking about today's episode, I thought back to some work we were doing, the Harwood Institute was doing in Mobile, Alabama some years ago. When we started that work on education issues, the community was divided. It had been stuck. One levy after another had not passed. In fact, they hadn't passed a levy in over 40 years. The community was at odds against itself. And then just some years later, all of a sudden, 27, when we began, in fact, 27 out of 100 schools weren't meeting state standards. Just some years later, after we began, 85 schools out of 100 were meeting state standards, and just 6 years after that, 9 out of 11 Alabama schools that were awarded the Torchbearer Award from the state were from Mobile. How did that happen? What was going on? How did that change really get started? How did it unfold? What was the catalyst for it? You know, at the Institute now, as part of what we call the Studio on Community, which is part of the Institute, we're undertaking a study of our 30-year impact. We're taking a look at a number of initiatives over the last 30 years to determine what allowed that impact to occur and what kind of impact actually happened. And it's interesting, as we've been looking at these different initiatives, there is one common theme that pops out over and over and over again. It is how these things got started and how they gained momentum. And they all had to do with the fact that initially, when the work began, the conversation in the community got reframed, that it got refocused on what really matters to people in the community in a very particular kind of way. And so I want to tell you 4 keys to how that got reframed and what it led to. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about how I define public knowledge, so we're all using the same definition today. You know, when we engage people in our communities, so often we engage people around what's wrong, what the problem is. And as you know, those conversations tend to lead us in the same direction that we've always had. When people start to talk about what's wrong, they want to know why the problem hasn't been solved. Then they want to know why the problem hasn't been solved and who is responsible for solving it. Then they want to know when the problem hasn't been solved and who is responsible for solving it. Then they want to know who can I point fingers at to blame for the lack of progress on the challenges that we're facing. And so when I think of public knowledge, I think about the fact that we need to learn something fundamentally different from the communities and the folks that we're engaging in communities. I think it begins by understanding our shared aspirations. You know, when you think about aspirations, they come from our gut, they come from within us, and they're always focused on what matters to us. And when you think about what aspirations that you have for your community, they often are actionable, achievable, and doable. They're not pie in the sky notions, nor are they focused on our problems, which lead to the types of toxic discourse I was talking about before. But our shared aspirations point us in a direction about what matters to us in our lives and what we want to achieve. And here's the other thing about shared aspirations. When we hear one another talk about them, we recognize that while we may not agree on everything, there are in fact things in this world where we're told that we're so divided there are things that we actually do share in common, and there are things that we actually can get to work on together. And then here's the last bit of it, that when we look at our shared aspirations, when we hear one another talk about them, when we hear ourselves talk about them, we realize that no one organization, no one leader, no one citizen can act on these alone, that these shared aspirations implicate all of us in the community in order to take action. And so I think when we learn this public knowledge, it holds enormous power for us to create change in our communities, and change that is focused on what matters to people. So here are four points about the real power of public knowledge that I hope you'll think about. And even more importantly, beyond thinking about, I hope you'll actually take action on in your community as you're engaging people and thinking about how to move your community forward. You know, when people tell me that they're doing our work, they often say, well, I'm using community conversations, isn't that great? And I often say to them, well, yeah, it's fine. I love the fact that you're using them. But how are you using this public knowledge that you gain in order to advance your community? So here are the 4 points that I want to mention. The first real power of public knowledge is that it reframes our public discussion. It reframes our public discussion on what matters to people and the community. Here's a quick example. In Spokane, Washington, the Spokane County United Way, which ultimately became a partner of ours, but before they did, they decided that they wanted to work on education issues. And they and others in the community, not just them, but others in the community, decided to focus on educational attainment. Over time, that morphed into this notion that we need to focus on high schools. Then when they began to use our work, they started with holding some community conversations to engage people in the community, including students in the schools. And lo and behold, what they found was that people in the community and students were concerned about middle school, particularly middle school transition. And then as they talked more to people in the community, what they realized was not only were people concerned about middle school and middle school transition, they were actually concerned about kids and whether or not and how they made their way, adolescent kids, and how they made their way through life. And they happened to be in middle school, but the issue was much larger than middle school, right? And when they began to understand this, all of a sudden they realized that the issue that they needed to focus on were adolescent kids who happened to be in middle school who were having difficulty making transitions. That reframed the entire discussion in the community. Ultimately, one of the things that happened is that they began to focus on these kids. They got 30 organizations across the community to come together to work on this challenge. They got 900 volunteers from across the community, adults, to come and mentor kids, support kids, keep track of them, and make sure that they got to school. And lo and behold, what they found is that truancy rates went down, retention went up, and over time, high school graduation rates went up. But the way in which they were able to bring these different organizations and adults together to support adolescent kids who happened to be in middle school was by understanding that the issue that really mattered in the community that they needed to act on was fundamentally different than where they started with educational attainment and then high school and then middle school, because really the issue was kids who happened to be in middle school. So the real power of public knowledge, number one, is that it can reframe our public discussion, which then triggers a whole chain of events leading to fundamentally different action. Number two is that once we reframe the discussion, the real power of public knowledge is in how we share that knowledge with others. This happened in Spokane. It also happened in Battle Creek, another story I wanted to share with you. There they found out that people in the community wanted to feel more connected. They wanted to make sure youth had more opportunities and that everyone had opportunities in the community. And as they were engaging the community, they found that the Burmese community lived in a little enclave in 3 apartment buildings in one part of Battle Creek, who were essentially, the Burmese folks were essentially invisible to the rest of the community, but they held the same aspirations, they found, as everyone else in the community. And in fact, not only did they hold the same aspirations, but they found that Burmese moms and families were lacking prenatal care during pregnancy, that during pregnancy, during delivery, that no one spoke Burmese in hospitals, so moms and doctors had to be on the telephone with a translator hundreds and thousands of miles away so that they could get instructions about what the mom was going through during her delivery, if you can believe it. And then ultimately they brought 8-year-olds, 3rd graders who were Burmese, who had learned English, into the delivery room to help translate for doctors and the kids' moms. And then they found out that once the child was born, once the baby was born, they didn't have care for the baby, proper medical care. And then ultimately, as the kid grew older, no one knew how to use child seats in cars. So as the group in Battle Creek learned this, they said, so what do we do with this knowledge that we had gained? And so often, as you know, when we gain knowledge like this, we start to wag our finger at people and say, well, you know, everyone in the community has failed. We're not serving these people well. Who's to blame for this? Who needs to take responsibility for this? How can we embarrass or shame different groups to act on this? And before you know it, everyone is at loggerheads pointing fingers and arguing. And the Burmese moms, in this case, nothing actually productive happens for them and with them. But here's what they did in Battle Creek that was different in terms of sharing the public knowledge that they gained about the community and in particular the Burmese community. They began to invite 1 or 2 groups to the table, 1 at a time, 2 at a time. And they said this: we'd like to share with you what we learned. And they asked 2 questions for the folks around the table. Just 2 questions. What do you make of what we learned? And what do you think it means for us as a community? Think about it. Instead of casting blame, instead of pointing fingers, instead of raising their voices, they essentially made an entreaty to people to say, we want you to think with us about what we're learning. What do you make of what we learned? And what do you think it means for us as a community? And when they made this entreaty to different groups, one group, the Regional Health Alliance, said, you know, we don't take action on these issues, but some of our members do. Do you mind if I invite some of those groups to our next meeting? And so they did. One was the primary care van, that mobile van that goes around the community providing care to people. And as the folks who did that heard this story, they raised their hand. They said, you know, we can change where the mobile van goes. Why don't we start to station it in this neighborhood on a regular basis so moms there can get the prenatal care they need and the care they need after their child is born. Another group who did Kellogg Community College, who had a healthcare program and a translation program, but had never put the 2 together, raised their hand in this meeting and said, you know, we could actually train translators in Burmese so that they could help in the hospitals and do other things to make sure moms have the care they need, the translators they need, the support they need afterward. Others said, well, you know, we actually, I think a car dealer said, we actually know how to deal with car seats for babies in cars. We can actually train people how to use these. And then someone at a toy store said, well, actually, I'll raise my hand because we can get these car seats at a discount. And so that started to happen. And over again, as they started to do this, people started to raise their hand. Over time, what happened was a whole chain of events unfolded, not just around healthcare in Battle Creek, but the schools started to raise their hand and said, we need a different relationship with the Burmese communities. How can we begin to interact differently? The Burmese community wanted to have community gardens because they have a traditional agricultural society, but they wanted a plot and they needed water. The school said, well, actually, we have a plot of land next to one of our schools and we'll provide water. So the Burmese community started that, and they started multiple community gardens, and now they're selling produce at a fair, at a farmer's market on weekends. But they also created a social enterprise that uses that food. Over time, they created a community center for the Burmese community. The Burmese people did create a community center in their neighborhood. All of this wasn't caused by the reframing and sharing of the public knowledge, but it wouldn't have happened without it. And so, number one, the real power of public knowledge is that it reframes the issues that we care about to what really matters to people. And number two, the real power of public knowledge is when we share it, people begin to see themselves in it and begin to raise their hands to work on it in collective ways. Number three is that the real power of public knowledge comes from developing different strategies based on what we've learned. Now, my first two experiences or examples demonstrate that, but I want to give you a third example. This one is from Oak Park Public Library in Illinois. They had done community conversations with people in their community, and they found that people had aspirations about making sure the community was inclusive, that it ensured that no people fell through the cracks, that there was greater equity in the community for people who were in need, or where there were gaps in equity in the community. And a whole lot of things came out of this for the Oak Park Public Library and the community, but I just wanted to tell you two examples that came out of this. They realized that a lot of the, or at least some of the patrons who were coming into the library were homeless, needed care, needed a leg up in life, but they had nowhere to go. And so as they recalled the public knowledge that came from their community conversations, they said, well, you know, we can actually address this based on what we learned. And so a lot of the patrons who were coming in who needed care had experienced trauma. And so the library began to train some of their staff in a trauma approach to engaging people and caring for them. Then the library said, well, you know, we don't provide direct services or help to people to give them a leg up for some of the issues that they're facing, like housing or the need for food or mental health care. And so the library took it upon themselves to begin to invite groups from across the community, like a housing group, like the police, like the schools, like other groups, mental health groups, to come around the table. And collectively, they created a continuum of care so that as these individuals came to the library, and the library staff could now engage them because they were trained in trauma care, they could also connect them to the services that they need in the community to make sure that they don't fall through the cracks, that they have a shot at fulfilling their potential and ensuring that they're included in the life and prosperity of the community of Oak Park. And what they're seeing is results already, that people are gaining more housing opportunities, that people are gaining more food. They're not just treating symptoms, but they're actually helping people get a leg up in their life and move forward in a more productive way. And so the third key factor, the third real power of public knowledge, is that when we use this knowledge to develop strategies, those strategies really do address what matters to people and helps us create a much stronger, more resilient, strengthened community. And then lastly, the last point, number 4, of the real power of public knowledge comes from our ability to align different groups, including nonprofits, faith groups, citizens, to take action. As I've said, you know, public knowledge doesn't tell us what strategies to do. It helps us to develop those strategies. And what we also know is that in taking those strategies and putting them into action, that public knowledge helps to bring groups together to align them to what matters in the community. So in Spokane, the public knowledge helped those groups keep their eye on what really matters in the community and how they need to align their actions to that. In Battle Creek, the public knowledge helped those groups working on issues around the Burmese population to stay focused on those issues and to align their actions to it. In Oak Park, it was the same thing. They brought those groups together into the continuum of care, and the public knowledge helped those groups stay aligned to what really mattered to people in that community. This public knowledge has this power to say to people, let's use it as the reference point for the actions we want to take and for how we want to align ourselves to take that action. And one last point about this alignment that I think is really important. What I find is that when a lot of groups come together, they're heavily turf conscious, they're territorial, they want to protect their own turf. They often want to get funding for themselves, even when they say they want to collaborate with others. And what we find is that when we use public knowledge as a reference point for alignment, what it does is it takes us out of ourselves so that we can see that there's something greater in the community that we need to work on. And as I mentioned before, that to work on these issues, to work on these shared aspirations, to work on people's concerns, that we can't do it alone, that we need to work collectively and collaboratively in order to take action that's effective, that's relevant, that's significant in the life of the community. So these are the steps I think that are really important in thinking about the real power of public knowledge. You know, they require something of us that I want to mention. They require an intentionality, right? They require us to be intentional in the choices and judgments that we make. They require us not only to do community conversations, which is important, but it's not enough. It's not nearly enough. What we need to do is to become intentional in understanding how that public knowledge helps us to reframe what really matters to people, number one. Number two, we need to make sure that we're intentional, not only that we share the public knowledge, but how we share the public knowledge with others, so it makes it entreaty to them to raise their hands and opt in and say, I want to work together. We need to be intentional, number three, in how we use public knowledge to develop strategies that are relevant to what matters to people, that are significant in their lives, that will be impactful in their lives and the life of the community. And number four, we need to be intentional in terms of the power of public knowledge, in terms of how we use it to help align groups and organizations and citizens to come together to work in shared ways. That, I think, is the real reason for doing community conversations. You know, last thing, I often say to folks, you know, sometimes when I think about community conversations and public forums and public meetings, that we become activity happy and action deprived. You know, we become so focused on the fact that we need to do community conversations. We become so focused on how many people do we need to invite. We become so focused on, you know, what's the shape of the table. We become so focused on, like, do we need flip charts and what kind of magic markers do we need and should they be odor free or not? You know, and obviously all those things are important, right? But if those are the only things that we focus on, we become activity happy and action deprived, because the action that we really need to take sits or lies within the power, the real power of public knowledge. Our ability to reframe what really matters to communities so that we can take different types of action. The power of public knowledge, that we share public knowledge so that people can raise their hand and see themselves in it and become part of what we're doing together. The power of public knowledge so that we align, that we develop strategies that are really significant and relevant to people's lives. And number four, the power of public knowledge that aligns different actors in a community so that we can work in shared ways. So I hope this has been helpful. I think, as I said, in Mobile and Spokane and Oak Park and Battle Creek, that the chain of events that began in terms of the action that we're seeing in our impact study, they all began by people gaining public knowledge and taking advantage of the real power of that public knowledge to catalyze and trigger that chain of events and to create a newfound momentum in the community, a newfound confidence to take shared action together. So that's it for today. I hope you'll join me in 2 weeks, same day, Thursday, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll announce the topic. Before I go, I just want to remind you that this is our 30th anniversary for the Harwood Institute. We are celebrating this 30th anniversary by doubling down and refocusing not on what matters to the Institute, but how we can better support your efforts to create change in communities, to ensure that every individual in communities can fulfill their God-given potential, and that we can create a more hopeful society. As you know, our work is rooted in the philosophy of civic faith and in the practice of turning outward. The work has spread to all 50 states in the U.S. and has been pulled into 40 countries. And we look forward to supporting you in your efforts in your town where you're doing work to make sure we're on a more hopeful path in our society. Thanks so much for joining me. I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.